Good morning. Thanks for coming back. I wanted to talk to you again. I started telling you I was going to do a series on women of the Bible, and I wanted to do that today. I wanted to get started on it and just see where we go with it. And the first person I wanted to talk to you about is Miriam, the sister of Aaron and Moses. And I think she's overlooked in the Bible. I think sometimes we just see her as this great, amazing dancer before the Lord and that kind of stuff. But there's a lot more depth to Miriam than that. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. We're going to start in the book of Exodus. And let's just pray. Father God, as we study these women in the Bible, let us understand them and let them become a role model in our lives, and that we could be worthy to be like them. And we thank you for this, Father, in the name of Yeshua. And so with Miriam, in Exodus chapter 2, we need to go back and start in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8. It says, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Israel had been in Egypt for almost 200 years. The last 83 years that they're in Israel, Israel had been in Egypt for almost 210 years. The last 83 years that they were in Egypt were years of bondage and slavery, and all kinds of negative things happened. And that's because there was a Pharaoh that rose up, and they didn't know, he didn't understand who this Joseph was. Joseph was gone. And he didn't understand the Jewish people. But the Jewish people had really flourished, and they had grown and become not only prosperous financially, but they had become a large number. And so this was an intimidation to the Egyptians. And they were afraid that they would become militant and overthrow the Egyptian government. So what they did then was just the reverse. They overthrew the Jews and put them into bondage. Now, there's a lot of people who think that the Jews built the pyramids. They did not. Sorry, they didn't. They built cities. They built cities of Ramses, and I don't know what all the cities were. But the pyramids were there a long time before any of this happened. So they built the cities, and they built, I'm sure, a lot of highways and stuff. But they worked, and they worked hard, very, very hard. And so if we start in Exodus 1 with the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and then we skip down to verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was Puah. And he said, "When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them up on the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." So this wasn't exactly an abortion, but it was a form of murder. And the Hebrew midwives were supposed to kill these baby boys. Well, they didn't do it. And they didn't do it because they feared God. And so when they were called back before Pharaoh, and he was saying, "Hey, what's your problem? Why aren't you killing these little boys?" And they said, "Because the Hebrew women are so strong physically that they give birth before we can even get there to help them. So we don't even know who the baby boys are, and we don't know who had baby boys." And that didn't go over real well. And once again, it's always this thing of wanting to kill the Jews, wanting to kill them. So let's go. And it came about because the midwives feared God that he established households for them. Now, when these Hebrew midwives, and when it says Hebrew midwives, I don't really know whether they were Jewish women or if they were Egyptian women helping the Hebrew women give birth. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that they were obedient to God, not to Pharaoh, and their names went down for all perpetuity, whereas a lot of other people who did deeds, their names are lost. But here their names go down. So then we see what happened then was the Jewish men and women separated, the families, the husbands and wives separated, and they quit living they quit having conjugal relations. In fact, there's some concept that perhaps they even lived apart because they couldn't stand the thought of impregnating and then having a baby boy and then having that child killed because of his birth and because of the fact he was a Jew. And so Miriam enters then in chapter 2. The funny thing is, it doesn't say her name. So Miriam, the birth of Moses in chapter 2, verse 1 says, Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. A guy and a gal from the tribe of Levi, the priestly tribe, they get married and they have a child. Well, later on, we'll find out that Miriam and Aaron are both older than Moses. So we have to come back and ask the question, well, what do you mean they get married, they have a child? And we know this kid is Moses. So how can that be? But it comes back to what I just said. They had separated because of this edict to kill the little boys. And so they had separated, were living apart. And so when they reunited, it was as though they had remarried. And so they got married, they had a child, they had a little boy. And so, and we don't see anybody's names. I mean, it's like, these are just people in a story. It could be Margie, it could be you, it could be Sally and Sam. I mean, it could be anybody, but it's not. This is the tribe of Levi, and it's very important what they're doing here. So when she could hide him in her home no longer, she made a wicker basket for him. Now, we all know that wicker baskets are not waterproof, right? So she makes this basket for the baby, and she lines it with tar, pittum, to keep the water from coming in. And then she puts the baby in the basket, and she puts him in the Nile. Can you imagine what her heart must have felt like when she did that? How devastating it would have been to see this beautiful, beautiful baby boy, perfect in all aspects, and you're his mother, and you're putting him into the Nile and trusting God. That's trust. That's a lot of trust there. And so the daughter, whom we don't know her name yet, but she's told by her mother, follow along. Go along now along the riverbanks and see what happens. Because I can't stand it. I can't stand not knowing. And yet my heart's broken, and I can't go along. So you go and you follow. So this little girl was, I would say she was 6, 7, I'll even say maybe 8 years old then. She was old enough to know that this was very important and very dangerous, but she was also very sharp, very, very quick-witted, and she knew what to do. Now, I don't think her mom had rehearsed her, because nobody knew what was going to happen to this baby. And for all we know, he could have gotten carried away in a current and flushed out somewhere. We don't know. But she followed the basket through the Nile, and all of a sudden it came to rest in verse 5. It says, Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens, walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. And when she opened the basket, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. This is the daughter of Pharaoh. She knows the edict, and yet here's this Hebrew baby. Her heart breaks for this beautiful baby boy, and she picks him up, and she takes him as hers. In her heart, she adopts this child. And so here we come, this little girl, the sister, the older sister, she comes along in verse 8, and she says, verse 7, she says, to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for you? I mean, okay, now this is a smart kid. You know what? Really savvy. And she says, okay, now we have this baby. Pharaoh's daughter is not given birth. She's not able to nurse the child and give him nutrition, so mom can do it. And so Pharaoh's daughter says, yes, do that. Go get a Hebrew woman and bring her to me, and she can nurse the baby. This takes a lot of guts. You know what? Because along comes mom. We don't know her name yet. Along comes mom. For her to be able to nurse a baby means that she's given birth recently, because she has milk to give. And so there's no questions asked. Nothing's asked. There's a lot of trust going on here. They're trusting Pharaoh's daughter with this baby. What else could they do? And when mom goes to the Pharaoh's daughter, she doesn't know what's going to happen to her, because they could take her and torture her and make her admit that this is her child and that she needs to take the child, but also probably they would kill her too. And so there's a lot of scary stuff happening here, a lot of trust going down. So she takes the baby home and she nurses him. And not only does she nurse him, she gets paid for it. Is that cool or what? I mean, that's God. You know, when he does these things, he goes all the way. He takes care of the family. He takes care of the child. He takes care of their sustenance. This is God in the best form. But he also knows who this baby is. This is baby Moses coming down the pike. So anyhow, she nurses the baby in chapter 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, or Moshe, and said, because I drew him out of the water. Now, I'm thinking that probably the baby was 3 years old when he's taken back to Pharaoh's daughter. 3. And the reason I think that is because it is the Jewish tradition to wean a child by 3. By 3, they're potty trained. They're no longer nursing. They're no longer dependent on the mom. In fact, even today, in many Jewish communities, they have a situation where they don't even cut the child's hair until he's 3 years old. So this is what I'm thinking is happening here. He's 3 years old. And if so, he has had the formative years with his natural mother. And she's been able to teach him, to love him, to pray over him, to plant seeds of God in him, to teach him Torah. Now we might say, well, Margie, that's pushing a little bit, saying you're teaching a 3-year-old Torah. But have you ever watched the Jewish children in their kindergarten? They're taught songs. They're taught the word through songs. And this little boy knew it. So when he goes back, we'll say at 3, to Pharaoh's daughter, and she takes him as her child, then we see this little boy now walking into a different calling on his life. He is raised there in the castle of Pharaoh. Pharaoh knows who this kid is. Pharaoh knows that this is a child who escaped the edict, but Pharaoh loves his daughter. And so why would he not give in to her? And it's better for her to adopt this child than have one of her own. And we don't have any indication that she's married, and we don't know anything about her really. And so Pharaoh says, okay, you can have the kid. So they raise the kid there in the palace, and he grows up. And then we see that he goes out and he becomes Moses. He goes out, he sees his people being abused by the Egyptian slave masters, and he kills one of them. And he does this out of the goodness of his heart because he's trying to protect his people. He must have some inkling that he is going to be the rescuer of these people. We don't have any idea what his relationship with God, the Father, is at this point. We just think maybe he has an inkling, okay? So then he goes out the next day, and what he thought was a good deed turned back on him. And Pharaoh says, you need to get out of Dodge or I'm going to kill you. And so he leaves. He flees for his life. So many times we see these heroes of the Jewish people fleeing for their life. And they go on the backside of the desert. And when they're on that backside of the desert, you know, we all hate the desert spaces, don't we? They're dry and they're impenetrable, and there's a lack of water, and there's a lack of sustenance. But it's a time to cry out to God and to hear him. And so Moses leaves. He goes 40 years on the desert, backside of the desert to Midian, and he marries a Midianite wife. Well, that has nothing to do with our story, except later on it kind of does. So what we see then as, I want to tell you this. When they were living apart, when Miriam's parents were living apart, and again, we don't know their names yet. When they're living apart, she says to them, you know, you're annihilating the whole nation. Pharaoh is annihilating the guys, the boys. But by your not being together in conjugal relationships, you're annihilating the entire nation, because no children will be born to the Jewish people, and eventually just through atrophy, we're going to all die. We're just going to be gone, and there will no longer be a Jewish people. Dad and mom, the Jewish community, get it, go, oh yeah, she's right. She's absolutely right. We got to get this thing going here. And so they come back together and they live together as families. So then I want to skip to Exodus 15. And in Exodus 15, we see her come out, and this is the first time her name is mentioned. I know I've already said it, but sometimes I run ahead of myself. So anyhow, in Exodus 15, verse 20, it's the first time Miriam's name is mentioned. And it says, and Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took the timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dancing. And Miriam answered them, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he has hurled into the sea. That's the first time we've seen her. All these years later, this is the first time we've seen her again. Now we know her name, and now we know the relationship. She's the older sister of Aaron and Moshe. So now we're beginning to get this chronological thing together. So now let's skip to Numbers 12. And in Numbers 12, is the whole chapter is about Aaron and Miriam rebelling. Okay. Do you have siblings? Sometimes they just flat get jealous. It just happens. And it's not always because of something you did. And that's what happens here. They get jealous. And so they go to Moshe and they say, you think you're so high and mighty? You really think you are? Well, what about us? We're older than you. We're more mature than you. We have callings on our lives as well. And yet you think you're the high and mighty one. And they take him on. And so we see in Numbers chapter 12, verse 6, God gets mad. And he responds, if there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moshe. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, face to face, and even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moshe? Oops. Kind of crossed the line there, didn't he? Because God's ticked off. Really, really angry now. And he says to them, who do you think you are? I'll speak to a prophet. And Miriam is a prophetess. We've already read that. She's a prophetess. So I'll speak to a prophet in dreams and in visions. But to Moshe, I speak to him on a one-on-one encounter. We have conversations. He is my man. Don't mess with him. And so then we go on and we see this little punishment coming down. Scary punishment. So the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he departed. He, being God, departed. But when the cloud left the tabernacle, all three of them were in the tabernacle having this family meeting. Do you ever get called into a family meeting? It's kind of scary. And the cloud of the Lord came down on them. But when the cloud lifted and the Lord departed, Miriam had leprosy. Aaron didn't, but Miriam did. Why do you suppose that God put the leprosy on her and not on Aaron? Could it be because as women, we are the life givers? I mean, she knew who this Moshe was. She was the one who walked along the water and saw to that he got the nourishment and everything that he needed. She had almost parented him through this time frame, and she had taken care of him, and she had looked after him, and she had loved him. And then when her mother gave him to Pharaoh's daughter, it probably broke her heart. And yet here we are, fast forward all these years. Who knows? I'm thinking it's probably 50, 60 years later, because we had time for Moshe to grow up, and then time for him to go to the backside of the desert to Midian, and now here they are in the desert. And we know the guy was not a chicking when he took them out into the desert. As far as we know, he was 80 years old. I don't want to do that at 80. I don't want to do that at 60. The point being is Miriam knew who he was. There was no question. But we had just this moment here of jealousy, and she gave in to it. She didn't take that thing under authority. She didn't cast it out, and she gave in to it, and she wah, 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 wah. So what happens then? And so we see in Numbers 20, she dies. And when Miriam dies, it causes a lot. Well, first of all, let's go back for a moment. She had the leprosy for a week. For a week. Moshe had talked to God and said, please lift this leprosy from her. And God said, you know what? If someone had spit in her face, she would still had to stay outside the camp for a week because of the humiliation of it. So we're going to let her have leprosy for a week. After a week, I'll heal her. She can come back into the camp. But she's got to learn her lesson. And if she doesn't learn it now, then later on, it will be more devastating than it is now. So that's the way it went down. And so she came back. And so we go on down through the desert and all this time. And I think Miriam gets her act together. We don't see any more about her until Numbers 20. But she gets her act together in the sense that she becomes a real prophetess of Israel. She begins working with the people, leading the people. And we have this tradition of believing that she danced and she sang before the Lord, not only at the crossing of the Red Sea, but later on through the encampments, through the bringing the people along. But there's one clue here I want to read to you because I think it's extremely important. In chapter 20, starting with verse 1, then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there. And there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. What about that? No water? They have had water on the desert all along. Now, if you've been to Israel, you know how dry that desert is. The first time I went to Israel in 1984, we go down on the desert. We're going to Masada, and we see these signs up along the road. It says, watch for flash flooding. And we think this is rather humorous until all of a sudden the bus comes to a screeching halt and our guide gets extremely excited and everybody gets off the bus. And I have tons and tons and tons of pictures of that time frame. And what you had was, there was no rain in the desert, but there was rain up in Jerusalem in the mountaintops, and that water had just poured down, 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 and it had picked up the color of the desert sand, and you could hardly see it. You could hear it, but the color was so much the same as the desert, and it was just roaring across this highway going down into the Dead Sea. And we stopped. Our bus couldn't get through. And we had to sit for quite a while before the army cleared us to go through that water. They had to make sure that it was safe for us to continue on our journey down to Masada. And I thought that was so interesting. But now think of what I just said. This is rainwater coming down from Jerusalem, watering the desert, bringing this flood waters down the desert. And you can see these water paths on the rocks and the mountains of Judea and Samaria. You can see how the water has flown, come down, and for that moment that it's flowing, you see these gigantic waterfalls, except you have to look really hard to see them because, again, they're the same color as the land. And so that's what had happened. And they picked up all the sand and dirt and everything, the waters did, as they flow. And so what you see then is just this almost indistinguishable water going down towards the Dead Sea. It would not have been drinkable water. No way. So then we have, going back to the story about Miriam, what about this water thing? They had water all the time that she was alive. But we see that she died and the water dried up. And so what about that? And so I want to go to 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 4, because it's summed up real clearly there. And the point being in the Bible that starting with verse 1. For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. He's talking here about, when they came out from Egypt and how the cloud and the pillar of fire went with them. And all were baptized into Moshe in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. A rock that followed them. Does that blow your mind? First time I came across this and really began to understand it, that Miriam, if we look at her whole story, she is inculcated with water. From the time that Moshe is put into the Nile, the time they cross the Red Sea on dry land, and she sings the songs of praise unto the Lord after they got across on dry land. And now we see that she's dead and there's no water. The water had dried up. And to think about this rock following her, well, how does your imagination take that? Is it a rock on a wagon? Do they have a wagon? Is it a rock on a travois, like the Indians used? Is it a rock in her pocket? What is this rock? How big is it? Does it have feet? How does it go? Does it roll? And it comes down to the point where it really does not matter how that rock traveled with them. The thing is, it traveled with Miriam, and she was the protector, if you will, of the rock. And then we see where Paul says, and the rock was Christ. He was the Lord. He was traveling with them in the desert. He was there all along. He was the water supply in the desert. So this is where we see that Moses and Aaron both get in trouble because they hit the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And the reason God wanted to speak to the rock was because it was a form of witness, and instead they hit the rock. They hit the rock because they're angry. Anger doesn't get us very far. It gets us into trouble. So I'm going to stop here. Shalom, shalom.